Guten Tag, guten Nachmittag.
Hello, welcome.
Wherever you join us.
We are going to start right on time, fulfilling the German stereotype, because in times respect it will become a typical German session. We will kick off right away because we want to start at 12:30 to make best use of half an hour. We are happy to welcome State Secretary Susanne Baumann for the keynote dialogue. Online, we are having also a guest that is under strain due to the budget week, not only because of the CHA conference. Omid Nouripour needs to join us from the Bundestag, so we need to hurry.
If you are an international guest and an online guest, housekeeping in 10 seconds this time, and we come back to it later on. If you need English translation, please use the button online, which is the world icon, Dolmetschen or translation you will find there. Plus, this is the most accessible conference we ever tried to manage. Live captioning for everybody who requires that can be clicked on online as well. Just go in the settings on subtitles, please. Wir haben ein sehr großes Thema.
We are expecting a huge topic at this conference. We will jump right away without further ado and without boring you with introductory remarks. Let us just mention the Zeitenwende, the turning point in Germany and Europe, triggered by the war of aggression against Ukraine, has certainly promoted impressive reforms in defense, armaments and economic policies, but has also exacerbated humanitarian needs, the need for reform. Huge debates are going on about a more bespoke aid, especially in Ukraine, more tailor-made humanitarian aid. Nonetheless, many observers see a deficit in the turning point that regards especially humanitarian issues. Shouldn't security and reform in humanitarian policies be at the center of the turning point? Today we are going to discuss this at a political level, the policy level. Tomorrow, rather focusing on various subject matters. I mentioned already Susanne Baumann. Michael Köhler is also welcome, the head of the European Humanitarian Aid DG ECHO from Brussels. Hibak Kalfan is joining us as the head of the NGO network NEAR from Nairobi. Let us start by asking Ms. Baumann, State Secretary. You have the perfect CV, may I say so. Since the beginning of the coalition in office, you have been holding this post, but you have been in the Foreign Office for 30 years. At times you have been leased out to the Chancellery. You have a strong defense background and disarmament background. Let me ask you right away, do you see a challenge during this turning point, which is very much focused on security issues? Do you see a lack of attention for humanitarian issues, or is there a conflict of different targets? A very intelligent man, much smarter than I. This is a quote by Michael Proska, and his conclusion was in the course of the turning point.
The conditions for the implementation of global goals such as foreign policy, climate agenda, etc., or the sustainable development goals are also deteriorating.
Do you see a conflict of different purposes and targets? What's your view on this? It should work, yeah, it should work. Okay, now, so I had switched it off. Well, thank you very much for this very valuable and important question. Of course, we are dealing with it in the Foreign Office, similar to the humanitarian community. I believe this term of Zeitenwende, turning point, is considered to be rather focusing on the military and security policies. What belongs and what triggered this turning point, it was the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, and also the fragility and also the vulnerability of Germany and Europe. So the major theme is security. This melody, the tune to which we have been singing, security only together with Russia. We need now to provide security against Russia. That's the core meaning of Zeitenwende, which had a direct impact on those areas that we consider to be sufficient deterrence capacities. So the analysis is clear. However, if we look closer, humanitarian needs, we are seeing an enormous growth of humanitarian needs in Ukraine. Look at the situation. 40% of energy infrastructure has been destroyed by Russian attacks. The winter is drawing near. The temperatures are going down. Zelensky recently announced the establishment of heating centers, a humanitarian catastrophe that is going on in Ukraine. It is our duty to help people there, to support them. This is one point. The other point is we must never lose sight of, and we are not losing sight of, the global implications of this war. The food crisis, the energy crisis, all this in combination with the impact of the climate change in unstable regions where conflicts have been going on endlessly for decades. We see a clear increase in the need for humanitarian action. For the first time, a strong increase in humanitarian needs in Europe, but at the same time, also a global increase. So we have to analyze with greater clarity, how can we use the resources that we have at hand in a more efficient way? So, and if we call this the turning point in humanitarian aid, I am totally in agreement with you. You mentioned some concrete numbers, and the criticism is leveled quite often against the humanitarian budgets. The humanitarian budget of the Federal Republic has been stabilized at the last year's level. In many European countries, the situation is worse. We are going to discuss this with Michael Köhler. At the same time, we hear so much criticism that the funding for Ukraine crisis is much better than the one for other crises. Look at the German funding. As of now, you can see it here. Ukraine crisis, 13.4% of all the resources that have been provided. It doesn't sound so overwhelming. Nonetheless, it's the biggest single item on this chart. In other countries, the dominance of the Ukraine funding becomes even more explicit. Look at the funding for various humanitarian crises. Talking about Europe, we have a political priority for just one crisis, an excessive focus against the underfunded crisis in Yemen, Mozambique, and Syria, and Ukraine covers almost 75% of the European funds. Well, may I mention once again the numbers? German humanitarian aid this year, 2022, we have an absolute maximum for the humanitarian aid system with 3.2 billion euros. The foreign minister stated it explicitly and on purpose on the last leg that we have provided another billion for countering the food crisis, also thanks to the support by the German Bundestag. These funds will be used in a very targeted way along the lines of this distribution that we saw just a moment ago in the chart. And these funds will be funneled to those regions that suffer most heavily from the food crisis. No matter how big your budget is, you need to balance your efforts. Where can I use my resources best? Oh, I think we have a very outweighed and considerate distribution. Ukraine is on our doorsteps, and so we have a particularly high responsibility. But we all are well aware, from the minister downwards, that we will certainly never lose sight of the other global crises, nor will we let them alone. No. Similar to what we did in the past. Look at the distribution. I would say we could do some good with this 3.2 billion euros. We will start with the next budget in 2023 with a first draft of 2.7 billion, somewhat below what has been paid out in this year on aggregate. But I'm very confident because experience tells us over the last years, if further needs arise, we will find a good solution together with the Bundestag. Yes, okay, we need to focus on Ukraine. That's correct. But it is not at the expense of the other crises. So you would say, all in all, we have too high a concentration of the Ukrainian crisis. Let us mention keywords like coordination. We are going to elaborate on this this day further on. International figures allow humanitarian operations to be funded at 3/4. Other operations by the end of this year have not yet been financed at a 25% level. Is it a simple, is it a question of lack of coordination, or is it just the security interests? Well, I think it's also linked to the geographical position of the large donors. These are primarily European and Western countries, because they see it right in front of their eyes that Ukraine needs concrete, instantaneous help. That's the reason why we have focused on Ukraine. But it's of the utmost importance, and I think that's is reflected by the states of the global south. In our regions, they tell us we are living and going through conflicts for decades. You do not care for them. And now you expect us to support you against Russia and for Ukraine. Now, for those countries in the global south, it is of extreme importance. And that's also why we make sure that further support is lent to the global south, not only in humanitarian issues, but also in so many other areas. Now we can flag it clearly. We do see your problems. We try to become active and to mitigate those crises. The entire question of equity, the West against the global south. Well, we as the federal government must do everything we can to pay tribute to this debate and not to slide into an antagonism. And Hibak Kalfan will certainly also address this issue. African representatives do have a point. We do have in parts a Eurocentric view. Would you agree? Well, from the perspective of so many African states, I can understand it. Yes, of course, they focus on problems that are emergent in their countries with a certain, how shall I put it, they feel a certain unease in view of this concentration on Ukraine in connection with European security. Let's talk a little bit about content issues of humanitarian aid, apart from money. Reforms of humanitarian aid seems to be more cogent than ever from a humanitarian point of view in the times of turning point. Don't we need a much more localized aid in Ukraine? Again, local aids feel pushed aside by this gigantic machinery of humanitarian aid? Isn't it that we need a totally different sort of funding? These are two issues that belong to this chapter of grand bargain and humanitarian aid and are being debated also under German leadership. We do not see so much progress, even under President Biden. Is there a lack of understanding? When we tune into new times, do we need to take humanitarian issues much more seriously? I absolutely agree on what you have been saying. 2016, the Humanitarian Summit, what has happened since then? I'm always impatient. I think everything should go on much faster. Whatever you bring up in terms of reforms. And so look at the two big issues you mentioned. There's flexibilization of funding, moving away from the earmarking. Well, we on our part have a ratio of, I think, 40%. I think 40% share of non-earmarked funds is a good thing. And what we hear from the non-government international organizations, they can live fairly well with it because using these funds has become much easier and reacting to crisis is easier. Regionalization, localization, the second area. Well, just this Monday, I talked to Martin Griffith of OCHAT, but also with so many others. I think the case of Ukraine shows us we need to push much more forward in this direction in combination with the question, how do we deal in humanitarian aid with the climate crisis? If you have the keywords of resilience, how can humanitarian aid help to shape a better resilience fighting the climate change? You cannot move around localization and regionalization. Another point that is very close to our heart in the Foreign Office is a prospective humanitarian aid, predictive aid, our G7 efforts that we have brought forward during our presidency. We should focus on greater continuity because with a relatively low expenditure, we can also prevent disastrous consequences. You've mentioned this keyword of a more local aid. Well, there are certain observers that claim Germany could bring in much more political and personnel weight. Let's put this in front here. The fraction of manpower is used by Germany compared to other countries in the areas of humanitarian aid. Do we have to shift priorities in your ministry? Well, some years ago, we set up a proper department for humanitarian aid and stabilization programs, or in general for the area of stabilization. This department is still growing. It's one of the biggest departments in the Foreign Office. I think looking at the human resources, we are in a fairly good position. We have very efficient and effective procedures in place. It's not only the headcount that makes the difference. We have also a substantially increased budget. And the reform efforts, of course, require also conjunction with others and coordination on a European level. We have good debates going on. Our G7 presidency, well, we made an attempt to use it in such a way that the reform efforts in humanitarian aid have been brought forward. However, we are concerned that other Western states rather reduce their budgets for whatever reason. And, well, we need to comment this in a critical tone. We have not succeeded in broadening the donor basis for humanitarian aid. On the contrary, the Gulf states that until 2018 were important players have been disappeared practically. Well, human resources. The number of human resources is stagnating. Well, it's just the ninth part of the European Commission. Well, I can put this into perspective. I would also like to bring in our online guests and viewers. Once you have joined us, I cannot see it, Michael Köhler. Well, we can also give an opportunity to Michael Köhler as long as State Secretary Baumann is with us. Let's talk about Germany. You have the right target audience sitting next to you. What about the opportunities for a player like Germany that is confronted with huge, great expectations? Policy expectations are still exceeding the funding level. How can Germany become an actor or a factor? This is a question to me. Yes, I think I had given you an early warning. Very well. Okay. This morning when I traveled to Berlin, thank you very much for this invitation. I read your introductory statement or your paper. By and large, I agree with the conclusions that Germany plays too little a role compared to the financial cloud. It's too little of a player. It's more payer than player. You can say the same thing about Europeans, but look at the United States, Germany and the EU provide more than 2/3 of the humanitarian aid globally. Then you could expect much more. So when it comes to setting an international agenda for Germany and for the European Union, I would say there is room for improvement, or I would say that we have the capability to improve. Why is it? Well, we can talk about this endlessly. Germany should take a clearer position in so many issues. It's not a question of the government alone. For example, looking at the German NGOs are funded primarily by German donors, but other funding sources like the World Bank, European donors, well, it appears that Germany is a sort of microcosm and has little outward perspectives. Some organizations try to change this, but if I compare this to France, Germany, Italy, Scandinavian countries, well, Germany needs to catch up. Karlsgau, Sweden spends about 1/5 of the German humanitarian aid, just by way of example. Internationally, Sweden is more of an agenda setter than Germany, probably even more than the European Union. But I try to change this. So I would hurry on with Hibak Kalfan. I would like to, can I ask Hibak Kalfan, I see you. A cordial welcome together with Omid Nouripour. Great to have you with us.
You heard already that we touched on to which extent is there a turning point in Europe, Zeitenwende in Germany, and to which extent might it neglect that there might be a humanitarian dimension to it and actually a global one going well beyond Ukraine crisis. Would you have any views to share quickly for Ms. Baumann on that one?
Yeah, first, thank you for allowing me to join online, and hello to the speakers and the audience. It's clear, I mean, just as the State Secretary said, that we are being affected. Right? The other countries are being affected. The food crisis is a result of what's happening in Ukraine. And of course, there's understandable reasons why Ukraine is getting the funding that it is, but it's also questionable that the needs are getting greater. The last appeal was at 51 billion that I last saw, and we've only been able to fund, or the sector's only been able to fund almost half of that. So I think it's really a question of efficiency, as the Secretary said, and considering how we can be efficient with the current system and how we can think through using the current implementers, and how we can think through efficiency through localization. And so I think it's not necessarily about who gets the money and what percentage they're funded, but how really we use the money that we are pledging and we are committing to for more effective aid.
Many thanks, Hibak. And quickly turning to Omid Nouripour, before wir gleich noch schnell sprechen.
Before we are going to speak and before you have to vote on the budget in Germany, this is the last chance. It's 2 minutes before the hour. So thank you for this very important discussion. I just want to throw in 6 buzzwords and then I will hurry to the voting of our budget. First of all, we should use the term of Zeitenwende or turning point with a pinch of salt, because in this case, of course, is important, but we should not overstretch this term. And flexibility and local criteria, such as you just mentioned, great bargain. There was no need to repeat. And we have to find a balance, which is not easy to strike. If on the one hand you have the security debate, on the other hand you have the humanitarian aid needs. And I think we have to turn this around. We should not allow people to demonstrate that humanitarian aid is something against security policy. And last but one, Ukraine Plus, as described. Also, we should not forget other conflicts, but Ms. Baumann has said actually all the important items. And the last point, sorry for speeding through this subject, it's not the job of the people present here, except myself. We as politicians should do everything to make sure that the reliability will be increased. The fact that Ms. Baumann had to fight hard and that Ms. Baerbock had to make major effort to add some money to the humanitarian funds. But we should not, this should not be necessary. Actually, everything should be done that the NGOs, both the bigger ones and the smaller ones, should be informed earlier how financing will be handled, rather than just being informed at the end of the year when prices have already gone up. So we should use less to have a greater effect. But this is, of course, the task of us politicians who have to decide upon the budget. So this is a job of the government in Germany, and that's why we should do everything to help and support Ms. Baumann in her work. Sorry that I have to hurry for this voting session, and thank you for having me. And please apologize that I have had to hurry a little bit in my talk. Thank you. Maybe the voting is very quick and you come back live. Ms. Baumann, the last point, national security strategy. There is also criticism that the term of security is discussed very widely in semantic terms, but humanitarian aspects are very little talked about. So if you can say something about that. Yes, thank you. I will add something about the national security strategy, which is still in process as a strategy and will be published in the first quarter after having been approved by the German cabinet. So what is very important to us as the federal government, we should not use a very narrow term of security. When it comes to our strategy, we should rather think of an extended security terms. And looking at the discussion which we've just had and which you certainly will have this afternoon and tomorrow, there is a need to use this extended term of security and to develop it further, because this is exactly the discussion. With military means, we are able to ensure a certain level of security with our deterrence and with some with our defense capabilities. But everything which is along the lines of development cooperation and stabilization, or even in humanitarian aspects, is of course also contributing to humanitarian security. And this is also the term that humanitarian security should also be put to the center of the national security strategy. And you can rest assured that we will widen the term of security, which will include all those aspects which I've just mentioned once more. Thank you. You can rest assured that we are trying hard to fill this with life. And thank you for coming. Thank you for having you. Thank you for your time. Thank you that we could take part in your process and in your discussion. Thanks also to your commitment and the humanitarian commitment of the German government. We will remain a constructive partner of yours, and we will also inform you about the other discussions which we are going to have today. Thank you for having you, Ms. Baumann. Thank you to you, and I wish you a very interesting event. Thank you. All the best. Thank you. So just take care. There are some cables laying on the floor. So, Michael Köhler, we started our discussion today talking about the extended security term. Let's stay a little bit with a question on how this is appearing now in Europe. When you look at the other European capitals, what is the discussion there? Are we really having a very narrow view on this turn of an era regarding security policy, while we underestimate some humanitarian aspects? So thank you. Maybe I will also say something about funding later, but I will start. Thank you. What Ms. Baumann has said about the German definition of the European security term is also European consent since 2003. At that time, Christoph Preußgen was still one of the developers of the European security strategy, which exactly based on that extended definition. And in 2016, the strategy was updated. It was then named Global Strategy, and the European Council also approved it. And this is the approach which is actually the same like in Germany, like the discussion which is now taking place in Germany in the view of this new situation, and which has been consensus across Europe for decades. Of course, the devil is always in the detail. It's depending on how this will be put into practice later. I thought a long time when I read the title of this discussion, and we especially came across the term of Zeitenwende, turn of an era. I think this is a very German term. And of course, it's also a term which is very much coming from the security policy debate, and it's hard to transfer it to the humanitarian debate. And mostly when you have an English text, some leave the German term. No one is actually using change of an epoch or change of an era. They rather use the term Zeitenwende as was used in Germany. And this is exactly what we need, but it's a different type of a change which we are envisaging now. The Ukraine conflict, the Russian aggression against Ukraine, indeed added some new aspects, but I believe in many aspects the conflict in Ukraine and the humanitarian requirements are a special situation. A special situation, for example, because differently than in most of other humanitarian crises in the world, we do have a capable government. And when you quote Martin Griffiths, when you talk to him, when you talk to Ukrainians, you will see that other than in many other areas of the world, humanitarians are coming with white elbows. The government is not acting. There is no basic social services. And that's why we have to step in. No, in Ukraine, the government is also claiming to provide these services itself and to coordinate humanitarian help. This is a singular situation. We are actually dreaming of having a similar situation in other countries as well. Is that also reality on the ground? Yes, fairly so. I'm very impressed, deeply impressed of the capability of Ukrainian authorities, also at the level of provinces, etc. And secondly, in Ukraine, we also have a capable civil society. We spoke about localization. It's true, when you look at the financial flows of the European Union or of the Americans towards Ukraine, that in the face of the urgent needs of action, mainly money flows to traditional partners, and more than in other crisis areas of the world, the money goes to the system of the United Nations. Let me give you a little example. Presently, we are not only working in classic areas of humanitarian help, that means, for instance, the refugee allocation or accommodation, etc. But a very important subject is also restructuring of schools. Who's able to do that? We've got contracts which we awarded to UNP Ops and UNVP. That's a lot of money. No non-governmental organization would be capable to rebuild dozens of schools. So you have much more money available in Ukraine via the UN system. But if you look at how UNICEF or UNHCR is working, they are working very closely together with local Ukrainian non-governmental organizations. And that is so that we can't contract them directly, but they are involved in humanitarian world to a great deal. The European Union in Ukraine has built up 3 logistics centers in Tbilisi, in Kharkiv, and in Dnipro, and they are exclusively used to provide humanitarian material to NGOs and the Red Cross in Ukraine. And so a lot is happening there, and you can really build on that. Another aspect regarding financing, if I may, it's true that Ukraine currently is consuming a lot of humanitarian aid. We hear that 15% of the German budget. In the European context, it's perhaps even 20%. But you have to add 2 things. One thing is that in the European area, I can assure you that it's exclusively additional funding. There is nothing which had to be reprogrammed. We did not withdraw any humanitarian aid from any other crisis area, even the opposite is the case. We have record financing in other places in Africa by the European Commission. The second thing is that when you think of the percentage, and you mentioned the numbers just recently, which humanitarian needs are funded by, as compared with other areas of the world, it is true that, of course, Ukraine, as Ms. Baumann has said, for certain reasons, among others, because the major donors of the world are based in Northwestern Europe or in the United States, of course, feel a lot of sympathy for Ukraine. And we should not forget, however, that the Ukrainian crisis is in its first year, while in Syria or Afghanistan, we have been working for 2 or 3 decades. My fear is not to say whether the current needs of Ukraine can be refinanced properly. My fear is rather if the conflict extends over a longer period of time, and we all know if fighting stops tomorrow, there will be more years to come for humanitarian aid just because of the large number of refugees. The question is whether in the medium term we can also make sure this funding. And in the Syrian crisis, that appeared to be a major problem. It was not so difficult in 2014 or 13 to get the money, but funding was more difficult over the longer period. And I see a similar problem in Ukraine. Well, many observers are afraid that maybe there is too much focus on Ukraine right now, and in times of escalating needs in other areas, they might be forgotten. Your argument is that those funding comes on top.
Maybe starting with the funding side again, so maybe to conclude on that one. As a representative of one of the leading networks for Global South NGOs, how would you judge on, let's say, the Western European donors, how they balance between the needs in Europe, in the Ukraine refugee response, and if you look at other crises in all the countries you represent?
Thank you. Maybe I should step back and say NEAR is a Global South network of civil society organizations. We work in 32 countries, or we have members in 32 countries in the Global South, and we have relationships within 49. Ukraine is not one of them. And so we don't have a membership from Ukraine. But to also say that, that we continuously have been spoken to or reached out to because the humanitarian system was hoping that the commitments that were made at the grand bargain, we could use the example of Ukraine as a positive one. And constantly we hear from the Ukrainian civil society that that hasn't happened, that actually the percentages are lower than what they used to be, that the opportunity that the international community, I believe, had wasn't one that was that was what's the word, that was utilized, I guess. But speaking about, you know, the difference between the Ukrainian response and other responses, I think that there is an issue. What DG Köhler said, Dr. Köhler said about former disasters, that is true. But then there's a question about a place like Pakistan, where 1/3 of the country was flooded and $400 million was pledged, versus Ukraine, where I believe it's 4.2 billion. It's also the question of that. It's new crises happening, crises in Horn of Africa with the oncoming famine and lower numbers than what was pledged in 2011. And so the question is with the issues getting larger and larger and the crises getting larger and larger, not taking into account former crises, the amount of percentage that's being pledged to these countries. I think that's where the frustration comes from. And it also comes from this idea of, yes, scalability when it comes to the UN has been a conversation. From our members, it's really a question. It's a question where commitments around quality funding, multiple year funding, flexible funding is agreed upon at the global discourse, but it never happens at the country level. I'm now here in Nairobi at our 3rd regional meeting. I've already spoken to hundreds of our members over the last couple of weeks, and a majority of them say we still do not get overheads. We still are on 3 to 6 month contracts when it comes to response. So it's making sure that the commitments that are made at the global level are trickled down to the national level, and that the commitments we're constantly making at the grand bargain in other spaces are being held to account at the national level.
Mm-hmm. Many thanks, Hibak. Maybe we try to conclude on this point on quality and quantity of funding, and surely something to touch again with you, Michael. Und vielleicht können wir einmal kurz die Grafik zeigen.
Maybe show the chart regarding the funding of the European Commission for the Ukraine part. We see 26.9% according to OCHA FTS for Ukraine, and the earmarked part is the 2nd largest response in Turkey for Syrians. Now, there is one point which should be mentioned. It is additional funding, and one could imagine, ideally, when we speak about flexible funding, the additional money should also be distributed according to the humanitarian principle of being needs-based. And of course, there are some dynamics, and also in the German parliament, there is more money provided for crises which are more to the heart of the parliamentarians. Are there conflicts indeed, or what is your take on that? So first of all, these percentages are not correct. I mean, this year, for example, humanitarian aid was about 2.7 billion euros, and Ukraine got 500 million. So it can't be this percentage mentioned here. So it's, well, the numbers, of course, are not up to date. You took the numbers of the 22nd of November, and mainly they will be based on the reports finished by summer this year. And of course, there is a certain backlog. I'm not speaking about any manipulation, but there is certainly a focus on Ukraine, but there is also a focus on Ukraine with the additional funding which we would not have had otherwise. And it's also true what Hibak has said, that for other crises, there was not provided that much money, but there is also a lot of money. For instance, Pakistan. In Pakistan, normally we've got a program of 5 to 10 million euro. This is mainly used for preventing disasters. And now on top, we put 30 million as a response to these recent crises. The flooding in Pakistan is, of course, dramatically underfinanced. That is true, but at least with the 30 million, the European Union is one of the major donors. And this is certainly not the end of the story. Tragically, this flooding happened at a time when the money of this budgetary year had already been spent. Of course, we can use some reserves, but it's very difficult to put on the table 300 million on top. And other tragedy is that development aid is retreating from some other fragile area. It's not only Pakistan, but also other areas. But how is this funding program? I can't say that Ms. Baumann is doing this at the how she is doing it, but I can tell you how the European Union works in that respect. There are two things. First of all, we start the year with a certain budget. For 2023, we have just provided about 1.7 billion. That was the money which we can spend, and now we start programming this money according to the following criteria. First, we've got a method, it's called FIT, which really analyzes by the needs of all humanitarian crises of the world, and then decides the European portion in this aid to the crises. But it's not simply like that. We do not just take the printout of the computers and transfer it one-on-one on the allocation of the means. There are other criteria, however. And one example is the criteria of political balancing. We all know, you mentioned just Turkey, that since 2016 there is an agreement between the European Union and Turkey regarding the funding of Syrian but also Iraqi refugees in Turkey. And altogether we spent 7 to 8 billion euros on that, and 43% are used as humanitarian aid, and this program is now running out. So this is rather political funding. There are other political amounts. Just remember last summer when the Taliban were conquering Kabul. The European Council met, the G7 met, and it happened what often happens in those crises. They said, we've got a double answer, a double response, just very quickly to respond to this new problem. First, we have sanctions to the bad ones and humanitarian aid to the good ones. That was a humanitarian act. And at the same time, to be honest, we have to admit that possibly due to this conquering of Kabul by the Taliban, major refugee movements were started and triggered. Some people did not believe it, and in fact it did not happen like that. But certainly across the humanitarian circle, across the Omid Nouripours of this world, it also opened the bag on the pockets of some other budget or treasurers in the world. And then, of course, we thought, what are the additional reserves we can mobilize? We start always the budget of the year with an amount of 100. Next year, it's going to be 1.7 billion, but I can promise that at the end of the year 2023, probably at least there will be another billion, 2.7, 2.8 billion more or less, which we will spend. And then, of course, there is rivaling with the US, who's going to be the biggest donor. And this additional funding comes from the reserves of the German budget provided by the lawmakers, by the European Parliament. If there are new humanitarian needs based on conflicts or disasters, as happened with Ukraine, or when other budgetary lines are not spent sufficiently, and then the humanitarian budget can be filled up. I expect within 1 week that I will get an email from our treasurer telling me that we found another 20 million. Can you spend them? So I also would like to have this mail. So it's not about programming the budget, it's also about the political will on top to mobilize additional reserves. And the same goes for the United States, it goes for Germany, for many donors, that is the case. Thank you for this insight to the political interests versus humanitarian principles. This is an ongoing conflict in all these conflicts. No, in English.
The locally led humanitarian action is a key issue for NEAR. Europeans not necessarily are front runners in this regard, all of them struggling a bit with not all of them, that's not true. A couple of the Scandinavians, for example, doing it in a different way. But structurally, it's a big challenge for Germany as well to deal with smaller partners, not to give the big chunk to the big organizations. While you, I think, have a couple of ideas how this could be done differently, even in a setup which won't lead to having 1 million partnerships with 1 million partners. Would you like to share some ideas? What could be done better on the European side in this regard?
Sure. I mean, I think we had started from the beginning of the grand bargain talking about pooled funds. I think it's the recognition of the fact that community funds, local funds, activist funds that support these smaller organizations exist. So it's investing in the structure of these types of funds, which ECHO has done, which Germany has done, but to a larger percentage to meet the 25%. NEAR specifically, since our inception, we've had a two-pronged approach. The first one is, because of the needs of our members, we've created a global fund, a global humanitarian fund that only goes to local actors. And that has allowed us to give funding through a pre-approval process within 7 days of declaring a crisis. And those crises are actually declared by their peers. That's from a global perspective. From a national perspective, we've worked with community foundations to start to discuss how you can pipeline humanitarian funding in already existing structures. And we've supported where they don't exist in places like Somalia, the establishment of a national fund. I think talking about the financing as a whole and the needs getting greater, I think we need to recognize that there should be a diversity of donors. It's not just bilaterals. There are diaspora resources, there are local resources, there are private sector resources. Now there's conversation about climate change and climate crisis resources. So it's taking into account that I think we're not capturing the full picture, and there's an opportunity with localized funds to be able to capture those different resources and be able to think through it differently. And it's something that our members being able to respond nearly immediately in places like Somalia, before we talked about a famine back in March, there should be an opportunity for us to continue to resource them so we don't get to this point of where we're about at the brink of a famine. So it's about diversifying and thinking through how do we diversify, taking into account the barriers that the institutional donors have, whether it's staff, whether it's legislation, whether it's different systematic issues, being able to think through that collectively. And that's what we're doing with USAID. USAID is now terming it doing aid better with the administrator, but it's starting to say, speak to us directly, not through an intermediary, and we'll help you think through solutions that are fit for the actual community.
And Hibak, to follow up on that one, I mean, on the policy side, there are very concrete ideas on the table for quite some time. For example, in the grand bargain, that donors, even if they don't want to deal or can deal for administrative terms with many local partners, they could provide incentives. For example, that intermediaries need to work in partnership and are prioritized if they do. They could be more or less forced to forward flexible funding if it's received from donors, so they provide it to locals as well. How would you judge, for example, in the Grand Bargain Forum on key players like the European Commission and Germany in moving these structural reforms if it's not doable in a different way?
I think Germany actually is a really good example. In 2021, in the conversation in the Grand Bargain, what we heard was they were going to start to change their systems to require overhead to be shifted, whereas many other donors, it's suggested. I think that change in language and policy is a huge change that will allow for what we talk about capacity strengthening. It would allow for institutions, smaller institutions, to adhere to some of the legislation or some of the due diligence processes that exist within the different organizations. And the same thing for multi-year funding, the same thing for quality funding, the same thing for 25%. It's being really intentional in the language and even in the mechanisms in which, for instance, ECHO, your HIP, making sure that the language that's included in these partnership relationships are a little more, I should say, forceful, because right now, as local actors, we're now dealing with multiple layers. We're dealing with INGOs as donors. We're dealing with UN as donors. We're dealing with donors directly with limited resources. And so it's really putting it to the donors to be able to say, the more forceful your language, the easier we can start talking about actual efficiency and effectiveness.
Many thanks, Hibak. Before we give the floor one final time to Michael, please be encouraged to share your questions and points in the chat, either public, or you can share it directly to my colleague Darina Pilovska, and send the message to her. She will share everything in the chat in a second with us here on site. And of course, after that, the audience here on site will get the floor. There is a mic here next to me where you can already line up if you wish. Michael Köhler.
Michael Köhler, in this structural policy questions in the Great Bargain, could Europeans do clearly more in order to streamline or change the structures and the processes? I think it's a very important subject discussed in Brussels right now, isn't it?
Yes, please.
There's more of a dialogue with Hibak, and many thanks, Hibak, for your comments, and I can subscribe to, I think, 99% of what you just said. We have to distinguish here between a couple of grand bargain deliveries: localization, multi-annual financing, quality financing, and flexible financing, among others. There are others. On all these issues, Europe can do better, but Europe has decided actually to drive this agenda quite aggressively. We have done so at our first European Humanitarian Forum in March this year. We are going to put these things very prominently on the agenda at the next forum, by the way, to which you are all, and also you, Ralf, of course, invited, starting on the 20th of March in Brussels, 20th of March next year. But apart from that, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as we all know. So we have to do it practically. What does this mean? In our program for 2023, we are driving ahead, so to say, quite aggressively with a couple of forms of local funding. On the one hand, we have taken a formal commitment to fund more country-based pool funds, in as much as they contribute to localization, but also in order to strengthen the coordination role of OCHA humanitarian coordinators, which for us is very, very important. I have to say that there's a number of country-based pool funds that have no localization strategy. In such cases, we will not fund them. But where this is the case, for example, in Ukraine, South Sudan, but also many other countries, we are going to increase our funding there. We're also working more actually through the International Federation of the Red Cross, because it has national societies in every single country. And this also is a contribution to localization. And we have specific structures, such as, for example, the LIFT program. Have you ever heard about that? LIFT program is a program that we have in Turkey, that is handled by GIZ, German organization, and GIZ works there only as an administrative umbrella to distribute European funding to Turkish NGOs that work with Syrian and other refugees on Turkish soil. So we want to have more of these specific forms, which will allow us to make local organizations benefit directly. But I would like to insist very much that, of course, localization is much more than only direct funding. It's also a real partnership, dialogue on programming, a dialogue on sector issues, which has to happen in the Caucasus, which has to happen also in direct contact, and I encourage my offices in the field very much to do that. Flexible funding. This means, on the one hand, multi-annual. We have taken a commitment to increase our, how should I say, percentage of multi-annual projects by 30% from this year to the next. And actually, we find that de facto, we are much more multi-annual than we think, except that the multi-annuality was not planned at the beginning. We have maybe a 12-month program, and then there's a top-up, there's an extension, there's a second phase, and so forth, and all of a sudden, we are in the third year. Had we decided at the beginning, we would have saved a lot of cost for implementing partners. For example, when it comes to hiring staff, when it comes to infrastructure, and so forth. So as we operate, and the same thing is true for other major donors, I think in 80% of our cases in protracted crisis that unfortunately will not go away from the one year to the other, we want to go for more multi-annual programs. Okay. The third thing is flexible funding. And there I would like to hint to a problem. We have all learned lots of hard lessons during the COVID crisis. Hopefully it's over. And I will share one anecdote with you. When COVID became an international issue around February 2020, and we urgently needed to mobilize funding, my commissioner, upon our proposal, agreed with the first unearmarked flexible tranche of 30 million euros that we contracted WHO with. So Mike Ryan at WHO got 30 million with the only condition, spend it on COVID and spend it in Asia and Latin America. Fine, we had a very good conscience. We said, we did something very fast. It was unearmarked, you know, flexible, WHO can really operate. And they were extremely grateful. Problem was only that, you know, 2 or 3 weeks later, in many countries, in many partner countries, COVID became a real issue. And, you know, the governments got nervous about it. And then they called Brussels and said, hey, can you help us? We are partners. And this happened time and again and again and again. One African and one Latin American government after the other called us. And the answer that we had is, listen, we gave our money to WHO, ask them. We don't know what they're doing with the money. I ask Mike Ryan or ask Dr. Tedros. You understand easily. And by the way, Mrs. Baumann will tell you similar stories about the German experience. If you give flexible funding to a major implementing partner, and the flexibility is only on the side of the donor, but not on the side of the implementing partner, and the donor doesn't understand, doesn't learn, doesn't have information after a month what has happened with this money, which countries have benefited, which NGOs were financed, which operations were conducted, then there is an accountability problem. And people like Mrs. Baumann and I have a hard time then going back to our parliaments and providing this accountability. So I had to sit down with Mike Ryan and agree with him a special reporting system where we would discuss together on the use of these funds and discuss, so to say, about ways and means to have real-time reporting on what WHO was doing with that. What I've seen is that by and large, the major donors have become more skeptical about flexible funding due to their COVID experience. Because being flexible as a technocratic approach is nice, but if you then have accountability problems, you get under political pressure and you find it more difficult than in the past to mobilize additional funds, because for that, you need to have parliaments, for that, you need to have public opinion. So we need to revamp the grand bargain for another time, I'm afraid.
I'm sure Hibak will have a comment on that one in a minute, but if you allow me to give the floor to the audience, it might be about accountability in the first place with the big organizations. But Darina, you have observed the chat and you indicated there's quite something happening. So please share comments or questions with us.
Yes, basically I have 2 interesting questions. One is more on a policy side and one is very practical. So let me start with the policy one, which is a little bit more tricky. Chiara Janke from GISF is acknowledging that the term Zeitenwende is, of course, mainly a security term, but she emphasizes, and I quote, looking at the humanitarian context in particular, more and more local organizations are criticizing the concept of neutral humanitarian aid and are demanding that there should be more room for concepts of solidarity and resistance in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, unquote. So beyond this background, she's asking, what could this mean for delivering humanitarian assistance in the context of Zeitenwende, but also shifting the power to local responders? So that's a very tricky one. And to give you a little bit more time to reflect on that, I will continue with the more practical one from Barbara Dus. She's asking a concrete questions. Can you give us already a glimpse on how much funds will be allocated to refugees on the Polish-Belarusian border? So how much funds for the refugees on the Polish-Belarusian border, and the question about solidarity, more solidarity in Ukraine.
And the latter question is on Brussels funding, EC funding. Is that correct? Or?
She didn't indicate, but as
Right,
Michael Köhler is here, maybe we can start with that.
We give you time for that one. Hibak, maybe starting with the one, is Ukraine crisis, for good reasons, a kickoff of another, maybe Eurocentric debate, I don't know, on humanitarian principles? Do we need to redebate neutrality versus solidarity as a humanitarian principle, or is this misled because we focus too much on this one crisis?
So it's actually interesting. Over the last month and a half, I've had many conversations around the humanitarian principles. And a lot of our members have said, we abide by humanitarian principles, but it needs to be expanded. It needs to be expanded, and solidarity came up probably 75% of the time. The idea that there needs to be more human rights-based kind of support. The idea that neutrality, especially over, I think, the last several years, we have to be fair in saying that the idea of neutrality is not for local and national organizations. Because as we talk through localization, a lot of international community organizations have increased their staff of local staff. And the question comes in, does neutrality not exist with local staffs in international organizations? Is it just a signing of a paper? It's a little bit more complex than that. So it's going back to the principles in how the sector is shaped today, and having real conversations around the 4 humanitarian principles, and possibly talking about additional aspects that we need to consider with globalization, with so many different aspects that are influencing the way that we move around the world, the way that we work, COVID, lessons from COVID, about insular response versus external response. There's so many more dynamic conversations that I think that can happen around the humanitarian principles.
But just to clarify, Hibak, would it be an expansion of humanitarian principles by solidarity, or isn't there a tension? You can't have both in all crises, can you? Neutrality and solidarity.
No, but the solidarity, I think, should happen amongst, and that's the question. The question is solidarity amongst who? Solidarity amongst the humanitarian actors. I think that's where they were coming from. They were coming from the perspective of the UN, international NGOs, the Red Crescent societies, the local humanitarian actors, because ultimately we represent organizations. How do you ensure that there's solidarity amongst all? And that when it comes to neutrality, when it comes to crises, of course, we're responding to the first community at need, not based on tribe or based off of the different groups of a crisis. So it's taking into account one aspect for the multi-stakeholders within the system and how we're working with the affected communities.
Michael, how would you comment on the renewed debate about humanitarian principles? Is there a good reason for reconsider them, or is it just a zeitgeist debate?
I would advise it would be more important to discuss about the relationship between humanitarian aid and conflict sensitivity and do no harm. I think we all brandish these principles, but in reality, what we see, for example, in many parts of the African continent, is that humanitarian aid has very limited access, and has access only, for example, where you have government troops. So automatically it is seen by some as taking sides, although it doesn't. And that is a huge problem. That is a huge problem for the credibility. It's actually even a security problem for humanitarian aid workers. And you know that every single day, for example, Western Africa, to sign another letter of condolence yesterday, humanitarian workers are being killed. This morning, while on the way here to this conference, I had a correspondence with our diplomats in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There's a problem there. In the east of Congo, you have the offensive of the M23 movement right now. M23, again, under Congolese law, is under anti-terrorist legislation. So if humanitarians provide aid to people under de facto rule of M23, they might be liable to legal prosecution under Congolese law as supporting terrorists. This is unacceptable. This is totally unacceptable for us. The question is, can we speak to the authorities, to the president, but also to local district governors to convince them that no, humanitarian aid is something different. This should not be liable. So I can give you many, many examples, but also in Ukraine, up to 24 February, the European Union operated in Ukraine since 2014, but only in Lugansk and in Donetsk oblasts. And for us, it is very important that these projects also stay alive right now. They are awfully difficult. Many implementing partners can hardly operate in those areas that are now annexed to Russia, which we don't recognize, obviously. But it is a matter of principle for us that we continue operating there, because our only criterion has to be that people are in need. This is a matter of credibility. I don't think we need to act the principle of solidarity, because for me, the principle of humanity enshrines solidarity. I don't see any kind of tension there. It's part of it. You cannot show humanity if you don't show solidarity. If the word Zeitenwende has one sense in the humanitarian context for me, it has to do with the fact that due to the conflict in Ukraine, civil societies in Poland, in Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, in other Central and Eastern European countries now are starting to get active in humanitarian aid. I was at the Umbrella Forum in Bratislava, for example, in May. For the first time, NGOs from Slovakia, from the Czech Republic, Austria, and Poland come together and discuss humanitarian aid. And I think we need to kind of nurture this Zeitenwende to make sure that these civil societies and also the governance behind them that make money available do not only fund humanitarian operations in Ukraine and Moldova, but once, hopefully, this conflict is settled, they continue to be humanitarian players also in other parts of the world.
Maybe quickly touching on the second question, and yes, please get ready. You can even walk to the mic if you wish, and then you are the first ones. And you don't need to raise your hand, but please free to either way. The question on funding refugees at the Polish-Belarus border, if I got it right, of course, is going beyond, well, how much money is on the plate. It's, of course, about priorities of access for migrants to Europe. The European Union has been very flexible regarding Ukraine funds, maybe even a role model how to handle migration issues in the European Union. Having said that, it's a privilege for Ukrainians. We see no change in the Mediterranean Sea and not sea rescue. We don't see a change, for example, at the border, Poland, Belarus, in terms of access and financial support, which was the question. So maybe you would be happy to touch on both questions. Do we have the right balance there in the European Union?
Maybe, I think it was Mrs. Dus who asked this question, could be a little bit more precise in her question. Do we speak about the migrants crisis that we had last year at the border between Belarus and Poland, or do we speak about the possibility that as a consequence of the Ukraine crisis, more people could go through Belarus in the direction of the European Union? When Mr. Lukashenko let in Kurdish, northern Iraqi migrants, not refugees, into Belarus to put pressure on Poland and Lithuania, actually we mobilized European humanitarian aid to help these people. So I think we were probably among the first ones working with one or two international organizations, in particular also the Red Cross, to provide assistance to these people who were blocked on the Belarusian side of the border. And if the same thing happened again, we would do the same thing again, obviously. If we are speaking about the potential scenario that, for example, due to the Russian attacks against the Ukrainian energy and other infrastructure, we would have a massive movement of refugees to Poland, maybe via Belarus, which I don't believe, because people would not go via Belarusian territory if they can join Poland directly. But if that happened, obviously these people, I understand, would qualify for temporary protection in Poland and in the European Union, so they would be let in, they would not stay in Belarus. But if there was a need in Belarus, obviously, as the only criterion for us are needs, we would mobilize funding and we would help, as we helped last year with the Iraqis. Mm-hmm.
I guess it's also meant to be the political question if we allow access to refugees who are not non-Ukrainians but came the same direction and do now in the Balkan route as well. Please, your question, and maybe you are happy to introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Yulia Sporish. I'm founder of NGO Girls from Ukraine, and I'm representative of CSO from Ukraine. My question is about neutrality, because right now in Europe, we have a lot of refugees from Ukraine. And recently, Europe has accepted some refugees from Russia. and they host them in the same refugee centers. So there is a lot of conflicts between Ukrainian women and Russian women, or even between Ukrainian women and Russian men who is hosted in the same centers. What do you think about this neutrality? Because it's caused new conflicts in countries, in European countries, between two refugees.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And maybe Matthias Amling, I had seen who wanted. There you are. You moved, didn't you? Please. Yes, please. Follow up.
Thank you. Matthias Amling from WHH, Welthungerhilfe. Just one question, getting back a bit to the beginning of what Ms. Baumann talked about. I think we are getting, not in every case, in every situation, but getting much better in some situations to really predict what will happen and what humanitarian needs we are facing. So there is, for example, the whole UN Secretary General's initiative for early warning for all. So we are really trying to increase this capability. Now, the G7, as Ms. Baumann mentioned, have a commitment that they made to collectively strengthen anticipatory action, and they particularly commit to strive to significantly increase their financial support to anticipatory action programming. Germany, for example, the Federal Foreign Office for next year announced to use 5% of their budget to do that. That's 135 million by now. My question would be for the European Union, what are the plans to live up to that commitment? What are you planning to do in 2023? And also, that's connected a bit to the other discussion. Will that be accessible also for non-governmental organizations, particularly on the national or local level? Thank you.
Many thanks, Matthias. Please, another one, and then we take it back, maybe.
I didn't intend to break a glass. Thank you so much for this wonderful, very engaging discussion. And thank you so much, Mr. Köhler, for having mentioned the M23 situation, which I think comes to the point which I have humanitarian diplomacy. Where is the place of humanitarian diplomacy in these times which are rapidly changing? And in particular, may I just bring the attention of what's happening in Ukraine, where we now are seeing, WHO has mentioned this, there's going to be a health crisis that is of proportions not seen in the last 60 years. I think there's still more place for humanitarian diplomacy in this matter, especially for the EU, the technocrats, pushing even the very difficult situation that we're having. That's all.
Yes, please.
Thanks. So cognizant of the fact that tomorrow climate change will be on the agenda as well, I still wanted to take the opportunity.
Do you mind introducing yourself? Oh, yeah. I mean, I know who you are, but...
Yeah, Sarah Meschmoser from Doctors Without Borders. Thank you. So I was wondering whether from the EU perspective, but also from the civil society actor, Mrs. Baumann sounded a bit to me as if just using the available money a bit more efficiently might be the response to the upcoming and also predictable and foreseeable like humanitarian needs, which are way beyond whatever everybody could imagine. So last week at COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, there was a so-called breakthrough regarding loss and damage. But at the same time, one gets the feeling a bit as if humanitarians need to be a bit more anticipatory and a bit more resilience building, and this might quite be the fix already. So I would be eager to hear your DG ECHO perspective on that angle and what would be needed in terms to really be prepared.
Thank you. Maybe Hibak, you would like to start. Have been a couple of questions. Choose which one you like. Anticipatory action, surely an important one and a big trend. Maybe something you would like to comment on. Humanitarian diplomacy has been raised as a key issue. Do we have a lack there? And this is something which urgently needs to be stepped up. And on the funding side, is it a key issue to be more efficient, more resilient, etc.? And to which extent could this fix the job?
I thought I was off the hook because all of those questions went to DG Köhler.
That's why I gave you the floor.
Help me, please.
No, just to say, I think if I go a little bit backwards, that the conversation that constantly happens within our membership and with national and local civil society organizations in the Global South is that we need to start considering other resources, and we need to start considering the fact that they already work on a humanitarian development peace building nexus, but that climate change and climate crisis and the funding that has come in from the conversations through loss and damage, we really need to think through what that means in general resources. The number one affected communities from climate change are Global South countries. And so how do we think through beyond governments with civil society? And I'm going to say this, but I probably shouldn't, but beyond the UN system. Why does the Loss and Damage Fund need to go through the UN system? So I think that there are a lot of conversations right now that are happening with a lot of our members saying we need to be more proactive, not only in the humanitarian discourse, but in the development discourse, in the climate change discourse, and to be able to ensure that it's not just about the 25%, but it's ensuring that this additional stakeholder, which is growing, has a very clear voice. Humanitarian diplomacy. Sorry, the question. When it was going to Dr. Köhler, I actually didn't hear the details of the questions, but maybe you could repeat the question. Sorry.
I got the question in the way that if we need to step up urgently humanitarian diplomacy, for example, with respect to Ukraine crisis, but also beyond, and if we have a gap there, if that's right. Yeah, he's nodding. I don't know if you wish to comment. Otherwise, of course, happy to forward it to Michael.
In general, I think when it comes to humanitarian diplomacy in places within the Global South, especially where there's protracted crises, it's local organizations who get hit the worst. And so I think that they need to be included in those conversations, because when we talk about governments or failed governments and failed states, it's the civil society who steps up, and they're usually not a part of that discourse. And so the way we've seen it historically is humanitarian diplomacy covers the international actors, but doesn't always consider the local actors in that portion. And if we're going to be more inclusive, we need to be a part of the conversation.
Many thanks, Hibak. Michael, would you like to comment on all four of them? We haven't forgotten about the one about neutrality, which might be an interesting one also, going beyond the issue of Ukrainian and Russian refugees. We might also see humanitarian needs targeting Russians or areas occupied by Russia, which might be an interesting balance then in terms of neutrality.
Yeah, and you will have to help me by throwing the catchwords at me from time to time, just to refresh my memory. But to start perhaps on anticipatory action and foresight. These are big catchwords that I think are, let's say, brandished more and more often in the humanitarian sector, and more money goes into this. And I think right so. In the European system, we have a specific budget line for disaster prevention, which takes about 5% of our budget. That is nothing else than actually anticipatory action. But even beyond the specific budget line, we are increasingly dedicating money to anticipatory action. Of course, if you know that you have protracted conflicts, and if you know that you have certain effects on climate change, for example, droughts, but also floods, and you know that they will occur in the same region almost every year. For example, in Sudan, now every year you have massive floods. You have also situations in Mozambique of the like and so forth. Then you can invest more into anticipatory action. The problem is only that on the one hand, every euro you spend there, although you know it's a good investment that saves you humanitarian money later on, is a euro that you have to take away from the immediate response. So you always have to struggle with yourself. Do I take this money? Do I take this €1, for example, to help people who are suffering from the floods in Pakistan? Or do I use it for anticipatory action to just prevent that the next disaster will hit as badly as now? And that there we come back to the overall question of financing of the humanitarian sector and the very small donor base that we have, unfortunately, an issue which I think we have to discuss much, much more, not only in the big donor nations such as Germany and so forth, but especially there where we think others should do more. And it starts basically in some of the European member states. Foresight, I believe, foresight is a very fashionable word these days, not only in the humanitarian sector, but also generally. I believe in it, but I don't, because there are so many things that you can foresee, but there are also so many things, probably more, you cannot foresee. So I think to have more foresight and therefore anticipatory action is a very, very good thing. But at the same time, you even more need to work on the flexibility of your response capacity, because there are so many things that you can simply not prepare for. And let's not have any kind of illusion. In order to build local resilience, in order to implement anticipatory action, in order to build resilience, you need to have a decent level of governance. If that doesn't exist, you waste your money. And unfortunately, in many crises in the world, you have no governance. Go to Northwest Nigeria. Where's the governance there? Or even in Northeast Nigeria, for example. Yeah. So you need to have structures that you can nurture, that you can invest in. Sometimes civil society structures, not necessarily government structures, but you need to have structures. In South Sudan, for example, this is awfully difficult. Yeah. So you have to look at the local context. By the way, one word, and I was inspired by what Hibak said about localization. I'm very much in favor of localization, but I have to admit, we have to look again at the local context. There may be situations where local actors are simply too much part of a conflict or seen as being part of a conflict, and then international actors are the only response. We have also seen situations, like in South Sudan last year, for example, where in certain parts of the country, NGOs couldn't operate because the population in that part said, well, you have national stuff. They belong to another ethnic group that we don't want to see in our part of the country. So replace them by our ethnic people. And that, of course, was not acceptable. So, how local is local enough? So we have to push for the local agenda, but we have to do it intelligently, looking at the conditions on the ground. Now, give me another catchword.
Two minor topics: humanitarian diplomacy. European actors not really stepping up in the way they could.
Humanitarian diplomacy becomes ever more important, but it has two dimensions. One is to, how should I say, push for better respect for international humanitarian law. The big problem there is the impunity. We have years and years and years, and not only one culprit, of, for example, attacks against medical personnel in major conflicts by regular armies of countries that are represented in the United Nations Security Council, and no penalties, nobody who would be brought to The Hague, to the International Court of Justice. And many countries have not ratified the statutes of the International Criminal Court for just that reason. So we have this general problem. We have to push for better respect for international humanitarian law. And, at the last ECOWAS discussions in New York in June, I was part of a panel discussion, and I tried to tell people, well, we call it international humanitarian law. We don't call it international humanitarian nice to have. It's law. It's binding. It is binding for all the countries that are members of the United Nations. And therefore, we need to implement it. But then there is the concrete situation. This was the general level. Then there's the local level, where we have to push for better access for aid workers, for protection of aid workers, for the fact that all people need to be supplied humanitarian aid, where we need to convince the military, where we need to convince the local governor, for example. And that is being done at a very, very large extent, but still probably not enough. My commissioner is very much engaged in this. I will not go into detail because there's a certain level of confidentiality. There's a lot going on, but we need to have more allies. For me, for example, it is very interesting to speak with Qatar, as we are in the World Championship right now, about how we can influence the Taliban. We need to have allies. If only Swedish, German, EU, and American people are, let's say, doing humanitarian diplomacy, in certain quarters of the world, this is not very credible. We need to have local response. And therefore, for example, one of the important actors for me in future will be the African Union and also ASEAN. They can speak in a language that I cannot speak to conflict parties in their region.
A final point on climate. Climate might be a game changer in overstretching the Unitarian system in terms of funding, for a start, was part of the question. Is it an illusion that by more efficiency, more resilience, etc., we can deal with that problem, and we need really to face a totally different dimension of humanitarian needs in the future?
Absolutely. I mean, just look at the figures over the past years. Today, the 2022 Global Humanitarian Overview had figures of victims, but figures of financial needs that were 60% higher than 2019 and 100% higher than 10 years ago. And when in a couple of days, Martin Griffiths is going to release in Geneva, Riyadh, and Addis Ababa, the Global Humanitarian Overview for next year, mind you, the figures will again be higher. And this is before climate change kicks in at a very large scale. I have no illusion in 10, 20 years, the needs will go absolutely through the roof. And that means we need to be more effective, more efficient, for sure, but there also needs to be a lot more money. Now, how to get more money? On the one hand, more donors. I mean, mind you, how is it possible that the United States, Germany, and the EU together represent 66% of worldwide humanitarian ODA? Where is China? Where is France? Where is Brazil, for example? It's not on. We have to enlarge the donor bases. And it's not only the Gulf countries that Mrs. Baumann mentioned, but rightly so. Secondly, we need to bring other money into the sector. I'm working a lot on innovative financing schemes where we levy private sector money. It's not a panacea, but it's additional money. And the third thing is, and that is something Martin Griffiths says very much, we need to establish a new nexus between climate and humanitarian policies. And a part of climate adaptation will be done by humanitarians. And therefore, a part of additional climate money, in my view, should be spent also through the humanitarian sector.
That sounds almost like an optimistic outlook. Many thanks for that after the difficult debate. Hibak, do you have as a final word anything optimistic to share with us? But please feel free to say whatever you like. We have to conclude. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And I think the breadth of questions kind of show how much debate we're having within humanitarian reform today. And I agree with what Dr. Köhler said. I think we do need to think about this bridge between climate resources and humanitarian resources. But I should say, in my trips over the last couple of weeks in meeting with local actors, though I heard a lot of operational challenges, I heard hope. I heard re-engaged hope about the relationships that we can build going into the future, and patience really in understanding that this is not something will change over one day, but recognition that this is a long-term approach. And so I think that recognition is something that we should all hold when considering humanitarian reform.
Many thanks, Hibak. Many thanks to Nairobi. Many thanks for joining us from Nairobi. I know you have very busy days over there. Many thanks for coming, Michael, all the way from Brussels. Many thanks to Omid Nouripour for a new world record on the fastest panel participation ever, I guess. And many thanks to the Foreign Office for bringing Sts Baumann to us. Please give a hand to the panel, and then we have coffee for half an hour.